All right, everyone. Once again, we're joined by Greg Carey from Carey Systems, who will give us a detailed update on the status of the COVID-19 pandemic here locally, regionally, and nationally and internationally. And Greg, as always, we appreciate the immense contribution you've made to the work of this team. And thank you again for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Daniel. That's Daniel Holmesley from the Neighborhood Empowerment Network, who hosts this meeting every week. Today is likely to be my last one of these presentations, at least for a while, simply because COVID is reached this point of not going through huge changes week by week. So I wanted to review the status of the measures, as well as a few items that we've talked about in the past, or maybe just a little bit more detail. And then I'll be ending it with some information about the heat emergency that we just went through, that we've been talking about throughout the evening. So starting off with the numbers, the first thing I wanted to point out, I mentioned this last week, in the worldwide numbers, the death toll has reached 6.5 million people. So this was something that I'd mentioned last week, that we were likely to get past that 6.5 million number. And as of Wednesday evening, this is the number. We're at 6,509,000 people who have passed away worldwide. That's probably an undercount, because a lot of the nations don't have really good data collection. In fact, I've seen some estimates that the actual death count is probably in the 8 million range, but this is the official number that we see from the Worldometers data source that I use. We, as far as the United States, we are at 1.11% cumulative case fatality rate, which is the same as last week. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail in the next few slides. And then we'll also take a look that our 2-week CFR is continuing to creep up. We are now at 0.58% compared to 0.57% last week. So in the United States, our mortality rate is not approaching that 1.11% of the last 2.5 years, but it's also not heading in the right direction, which is in the downward numbers. So we take a look at the numbers for the week, and we see that for the number of officially reported cases, we saw about 500,000 new cases this week. That was compared to 600,000 the week before. So we did see a reduction in the number of cases of 19.3%. And if we take a look at the death count, that also dropped week over week. So this week we saw 2,700 deaths compared to 3,800 last week. And that is almost a 30% improvement over on a week by week basis. So where we stand right now on the daily averages are 74,000 new cases each day and 393 deaths per day, which is not as low as we had seen back at the end of the Delta and the Alpha and Delta, I'm sorry, at the end of the Alpha period, just before Delta took over. But at least it is had been quite stable since the first part of May through now into September. So the numbers are not getting considerably worse. They're not getting considerably better, but they are staying pretty steady. Questions or comments about any of those numbers? All right, this is where we stand on vaccinations. And this is one of the things that I've mentioned a few times in the past, is the reason that the US is doing so poorly in our mortality is the fact that we have such a large percentage of the nation that is not vaccinated. So what we have here is the darker blue areas are the ones that have the highest percentage of vaccinations. You'll see down here in the bottom, the darkest blue is over 80%. And then as you get into the lighter blue areas, you're getting below 50%. And then there are a few states, New Mexico, New Hampshire, and Vermont, for some reason, have no reports on their vaccination status. So that's what the gray states represent. But you can see that through much of the middle part of the country, we still have really poor vaccination percentages. Right now, I didn't pull up the map that shows where the worst outbreaks are, but you'll see that through Kentucky, Tennessee, and Arkansas, this right now is where we have the highest number of cases. It's also where we see predominantly the lowest number of vaccinations, which is really a big reason that the US does so poorly as far as the rest of the world in our mortality. So this is our San Francisco numbers. And as you see, what we are looking at right now is the gray curve, which is the number of cases, has really taken a nice drop from the beginning of May. So the beginning of May was when we were experiencing the new outbreak from the BA.4 and the BA.5 Omicron variants. We now are down to only 89 new cases per day compared to 500 when we were first starting to see the .4 and .5 variants take over. And then our hospitalizations have remained fairly low. They took a little bit of a climb when we saw the increase in cases, but they are now declining pretty much in step with the decline in cases. This is our dashboard. What we take a look at, I normally look at just the last couple of weeks as our primary focus. We now do have, for the month of August, the death count for the city is now standing at 41 compared to 45 in July. It's possible that there will still be a few more numbers added to the August numbers because San Francisco tends to really lag in death reporting. However, the good news is that our cases have dropped to 89 per day. So we have really done a good job of dropping the numbers from where we were in the early part of May to where we are right now. The hospitalizations are at 65. Last week we were at 66. So that's pretty steady, but still relatively low. The tests per day are still hanging out there pretty well. That's a combination of the tests that are done as people enter hospitals or if they go to a public testing site. And our testing positivity is now dropped to 6.6%. So that is now as low as it has been since April. And so that is really a good indication that San Francisco is really doing well as far as avoiding infection, and then also the other measurements. So let's talk about the difference between, I talk about CFR a lot, that's the case fatality ratio. And I wanted to pull this graph up that shows the difference between CFR and what they label as mortality, or what you could be, instead of saying case fatality rate, it would be population fatality rate. When we're talking at the mortality measure, that is how many people have died out of the entire population. And so that is going to be a low percentage when you take in consideration the number of people that we have either in the United States or even in the world. But it's really difficult to measure that during the period of the outbreak itself, because the numbers are changing so quickly that we tend to not use that number until things start to settle down. The case fatality ratio, CFR, is how many people have died out of the number of people who have tested positive. And especially they consider the official numbers here as far as the cases. And then of course the death count is usually highly accurate because that is something that is not dependent on how many people you've tested or how accurately you're doing your reporting. So CFR is the number that I've been quoting. That's this version. Mortality or the population is going to be this total. And so what I want to do now is take a comparison of how San Francisco compares to the rest of the world in the United States. So if we take a look at the world numbers, we see that the world's CFR is currently at 1.06. The United States is at 1.11. And if we take a look at San Francisco, we have had 1,021 people die of COVID since the beginning of the pandemic, which means that we are at a CFR of 0.58. So we are less than half of what the United States average is for that. And that is in line fairly closely with what the world total is. If we look at the mortality rate or the total population, the numbers are still kind of in the right direction. However, when we take a look at the world population of 8 billion people and the fact that 6.5 million people have died, the actual mortality worldwide is under 0.1%. So it's 0.08%. Again, as I mentioned on the previous slide, that is an undercount as far as deaths, simply because so many parts of the world don't have accurate reporting or even good medical practices to be able to track this. But that's the current status as far as the mortality. If we take a look at the United States, with 325 million people, the 1.07 million people that have died represents a 0.33% mortality. And if we take a look at San Francisco, again, our number of only 1,000 deaths out of 875,000 residents means that we are about a third of what the rest of the United States is as far as mortality. So just one more look at how well San Francisco has done, primarily because of the really aggressive prevention measures that were taken early on, and then a health department that really has done the best that they can to be able to make sure that things have stayed relatively safe. Any questions or comments on any of that stuff? All right. Either my headphones aren't working or it's a very quiet room. Good. Oh, there we go. At least that's working. How does this compare to other illnesses? So this is something that when we're taking a look at CFR, COVID is looking at, and this was a number that actually was, this slide actually was from a page that is a couple months old when the CFR was a little bit higher. But at that point, the COVID CFR was looking at a 2.1% for the United States. If we take a look at other serious illnesses, you see that we are almost the same as far as the death rate as the 1918 influenza outbreak, which had a CFR of somewhere between 2 and 3%. But we also really were lucky in a lot of the other outbreaks that took place that were able to be brought under control very quickly. So it did not end up becoming a pandemic, and rather had a fairly low number of impacted people. The avian flu, or the bird flu, which was in the early 90s, had a 60% CFR. So of 100 people that had well, if we took the 600 and we put that into a percentage, of each 100 people that were affected, 60 people died. The H7N9, which is also an avian flu, in that case was also 37%. So in that particular case, 37 out of every 100 people who had been infected with that version of the influenza A ended up dying in that outbreak. Luckily, neither of those ended up being over 1,000 people that were impacted before the United States Health Department at that point, which was very robust and responsive, was able to bring those outbreaks under control very quickly. If we take a look at Ebola, which these numbers are now worldwide, Ebola is at over 30,000 cases across the world, but it has a 50% death rate. So out of these 30,000 people, 15,000 people died. MERS and SARS, which were both coronaviruses that preceded COVID, also had extremely high death rates. So in the case of MERS, which was the Middle Eastern response respiratory syndrome, 34% of the people died. And in the case of SARS, 15% of the people died. So in retrospect, COVID, even though we have seen a really high toll as far as the number of people who have been ill or have died, could have been much worse if COVID had been as deadly as any of these other diseases that we had experienced in the last 50 years. Questions or comments about those numbers? All right.
Yeah, I have a question.
Yes. Yes.
I'm curious to know if part of the death toll or lack thereof with COVID has to do with how fast we closed down as a country. Because that's something that didn't happen with these other
No, and I was looking for the graph. I couldn't find the graph that I've used in the past where it had two dimensions, where vertically it was how infectious was, I'm sorry, horizontally it had how infectious was it, and that was the one where COVID compared to smallpox compared to chickenpox is kind of in the middle. And then the vertical axis was how deadly is it, in which we found that smallpox was one of the most deadly diseases that we've ever seen, and also highly infectious. the story here is COVID was highly infectious, but was not as deadly as it could have been. So when we're talking about these other diseases, it's not that well, they were stopped, so the actual death tolls were relatively low. But the fact that these other viruses were much more deadly, whereas if we compare it to the 1918 flu, the Spanish flu, there we had something that was about the same level of deadliness as COVID was. These other illnesses that could have broken out if they would have been able to escape, very likely would have had a much higher death count than what we've seen with COVID. So we're fortunate that the death toll was low. We're unfortunate that so many people ended up infected that we still had large numbers of people passing away. Does that make sense? All
Yes,
right.
thank you.
Sure. This curve, this is an interesting one because it shows the CFR by country back beginning in the early part of the pandemic, starting March, which is kind of the early point. If you remember me telling why I got into this long period of documentation, especially when I was producing 2 written reports every week, it was what was seeing right here, which is at that time, Italy was seeing a CFR of 14%. So in Italy, for every 100 people who had contracted COVID, 14 had died. At that point, the United States was fairly high. I actually chose this point on the graph. This was when the United States had its highest CFR. So in May of 2020, CFR in the United States was 6.1%, which means out of every 100 people that had been infected, 6 people died. And then you see the rest of the nations spread across as far as their range of infections. If we now move to where we are right now, you can see that even though all of the CFRs in the nations have dropped from where they were early on, that we still are in that top 4 of the nations with the worst mortality or the highest death count. Right now, Brazil is higher than we are. However, they have a much lower number of cases. So their number of deaths compared to the United States is less than the US. The US continues to lead the world in the number of deaths per day. However, they are seeing a 2% CFR compared to our, oops, what just happened? Oh, not now, I'm sorry. I just did a pop. Okay. Okay, where was I? Okay, so anyway, where we are now compared to where we were then, we were at 6% back at the beginning. We have now improved that to 1.1%. Brazil, Iran, and India are having a somewhat worse condition than we are. However, the rest of the world is really brought their CFR down to the point where they are below 1%. So that is another way to look at the CFR, and especially comparing how the different nations through all of the period that we've been dealing with have seen these numbers rise and fall, but predominantly improve. But the United States still, because of our very low percentage of vaccinations, are still doing much worse than most of the other advanced nations are. Next, there's more information about long COVID. The latest number that we are seeing is 19% of the people who have had COVID are likely to have some kind of a long-term symptom of at least 3 months. But I like this graphics. This actually comes from the CDC that lists the types of illnesses that are beyond the period of the infection of COVID. And it kind of shows you all the different ways that COVID can have an impact on different people on a longer term. So cardiovascular, respiratory, kidney, the musculoskeletal, and general areas are things that we've talked about kind of in pieces, but acute coronary disease, heart failure, in the respiratory systems, we have shortness of breath and low oxygen levels for longer periods of time. Kidneys can have acute kidney injury, including the need for kidney replacement. Muscle pain and weakness is common. General malaise, fatigue, and anemia. And then on the right hand side, we see Mentally, we have people reporting anxiety, depression, sleep problems, in the nervous system of actual diseases that may lead to death, strokes, headaches, memory problems, and smell problems that are lasting for sometimes months at a time, endocrine type of diseases, including obesity, diabetes, and high cholesterol, gastrointestinal, including constipation, lower GI issues like diarrhea and acid reflux, skin disorders, including hair loss and rash, and then coagulation disorders, so blood clots. Not everybody gets all of these, luckily, and because it is such a wide range of symptoms, it's really difficult to associate which are connected to the prior COVID infections and which would have been something that that person would have acquired anyway. But these are some of the things that long COVID can have an effect on over time, which is why continuing to keep our vaccinations up to date and then be reasonable about safe practices is still a really good idea. Questions or comments? All right.
Sure, I certainly can relate to the fatigue and the shortness of breath. I mean, I've noticed that. I had COVID in the winter. It wasn't bad, but afterwards I could certainly feel the fatigue and the shortness of breath, etc. So
Yes, and hopefully over time that will continue to improve. And most people it does improve after three to
yeah,
6
indeed,
months.
it has.
And then, but for some people, it has remained fairly severe to the point where people are no longer able, in many cases, to work simply because some of these impacts are really acute and causing really serious impacts on quality of life.
So Greg, this is really a great slide. Is this where we go to find it, to Washington University?
It is. I found it on the CDC website.
Okay, I'll look for it there because that's a really great thing.
It is, and how I found it was I looked at. I think I went to Google and searched for long COVID, and then looked for images. If you do that, a lot of times you get pages and pages of images, and then when you find the image of interest, you click on it, and it tells you which document it came from. So that's kind of a way to backtrack it. You start with the image, you look for the image, click on the image, and then it will oftentimes take you right to that document, and then you can reference the document if you want more details about all of this stuff.
Thank you.
So,
Okay.
Greg, is there anything that can be done, or do you just have to rest and relax and let it take its course?
So far, it's mostly it's resting and letting the natural healing take place is in most cases all that can be done. However, all of these studies that they're doing are looking for ways to really identify whether they can use specific medications or maybe bring in some new medications. So the longer term impact of all of these studies is that they will be finding especially some of the more serious things like the cardiovascular and the chances for stroke and so on. They will be putting their heaviest emphasis on those things that are most likely to be long-term or severe impact on longevity. And so the research is looking for better answers, but the most important thing is work with your doctor, explain your history with COVID, and then hopefully they will be able to go into their information and then find what the best available remedies are. But in many cases, it's just waiting for the body to heal itself.
I see. Thank you.
All right, so let's talk about the heat that we've seen over the last few days. I brought this up. This is from I have two different systems that measure indoor and outdoor temperatures. This is the one that I like because it shows you the graph of what happened. And this graph is quite similar to what we saw in 2017, which was when we had the worst heat emergency so far. And coincidentally, both of those were over Labor Day. The one in 2017 was worse, but these trends as far as temperatures looked almost identical. So here's what happens when we have a serious heat emergency is we have a hot day. So we started on Sunday with a low overnight of 57 degrees. And then on Sunday, we got up to 83 degrees. But at night, we only cool down to 70 degrees. So I marked that in orange because that's kind of okay, but it's not anything near our normal nighttime temperatures. So by the time we got to the next day, we now were looking at a 90, and these are Diamond Heights. So different parts of the city would have seen different highs and lows. And Diamond Heights is weird because most of the year we are cooler than the rest of the city because of our elevation. But when you are in a period when there is no wind, then heat rises and these higher elevations then become much hotter than you might have down in the valley. So on September 5th, we hit 93 degrees. And that night we only got down as the lowest temperature for the evening of 79 degrees. We barely cleared 80 degrees for the low for the night, which then meant next day. By the way, each day the weather forecast was forecasting temperatures in the 70s. So they were saying, 74, 76 is about what you're going to see. And boom, we're at 91 degrees. After the 6th, we actually did have a nice cooling period. It dropped to 65 degrees that night. However, the next day it did get to almost 80 degrees. Last night we were able to get to 68 degrees, and luckily we hit that lower temperature at about 2 in the morning. So I had my fan running on high all night to cool the apartment. We live on the top floor, so we have the double impact of the heat of the air, but also the heat from the roof that comes through the insulation. And then today we hit a high of 87 degrees. So this is the curve that we saw this weekend. When we were looking at 2017, we actually saw 3 nights in a row that did not get below 80 degrees for the low temperature. And that was when we had a large number of people who died and dozens of people that were hospitalized with heat illness for that weekend. So that's how Labor Days have happened. And this is how, at least in Diamond Heights, we end up with heat emergencies that are not predicted. If you'll recall, these couple of slides I'm pulling from the training we did back in 2020 on heat emergencies. So I took a couple of slides just as a reminder as to how this works. Normally, San Francisco has Carl the Fog that comes in every afternoon and looks kind of like that. And the thing that makes us special is that we are the only part of the western coastline that has a gap in the coastal mountain range. So these 2 lines represent the coastal mountain range that starts in San Francisco and goes all the way down to Los Angeles. And then on the North Bay, we start in the North Bay, and that goes all the way up to Washington State. But in San Francisco, we have this gap, which is called the Golden Gate, before they built the bridge. And what happens is when we have onshore flows of wind, we are pulling the cool air off of the Pacific Ocean. And what's actually happening here is the high heat in the Central Valley is causing a high pressure center, which is now causing the air to be pulled in through this gap. And that's why normally we have cool, at least in the afternoon and evenings, we have cool temperatures. What happens when we either have, like we've had this week, no wind at all, or an offshore wind, which we haven't had so far this year, but could still have one, is that this high pressure center that normally is sitting below San Francisco, so that the winds are now rotating, pulling the air in off of the ocean, moves farther north. And now the flow of the wind turns the air around. So now the hot air from the Central Valley is pulled through the Golden Gate and pushed out to the ocean. But now we're looking at the 100-degree plus temperatures that have built up in the valley. And now those are what we're experiencing. We could still see this happen this year if we have another heat emergency. We could see even hotter temperatures than we saw this week. But luckily this week, we didn't really have an offshore wind. We just had a 0 wind period where the onshore flow had stopped and allowed the temperatures to build up. So that's explaining why most of the year we have that natural air conditioning, but every once in a while it stalls, and either we have virtually no wind at all, or in the worst case conditions, it goes to an offshore flow. This is a little movie that was part of that training. I'm just going to play it again for your entertainment, but this explains why it's important to understand the difference between the indoor and the outdoor temperatures as far as how you're going to use fans if you don't have air conditioning. So I'm just going to play it now, and then we can wrap it up.
Let's talk about thermometers. You need to know when the temperature outside is cooler than inside before you open the windows and let in fresh air. Consider a thermometer that measures both inside and outside conditions. These devices usually measure humidity as well as temperature. There are two types. Basic models consist of two parts. The base station has digital readouts that measure the readings where it sits. The second part is a small battery-powered module outside. It sends readings wirelessly to the base station. You must mount it in a shaded area either under a roof or on the north side of your home because sun shining on the module will cause incorrect outside readings. The base station might have additional information such as date and time and general weather forecasts. The second type of thermometer connects to the internet to let you monitor readings with an application on your smartphone or computer. This is particularly helpful if you want to monitor the safety of a person living at a different address, such as a parent or someone needing reminders about their safety. As with the basic type, a small module mounted outdoors sends readings to the main module. Some systems allow for more than one remote sensor, so, for example, you can track the reading from a bedroom in addition to the readings at the main module and outdoors. In addition to showing current conditions, the applications let you see the history of readings so that you can see the lowest temperature overnight or trends over weeks or months.
So that's part of the training, and I put the link to that training in the chat earlier if you want to review it. It runs about an hour, but it really takes you through the proper use of fans, what to do about identifying heat illness, and then also as far as first aid. We use the infographics. If you go to the link that contains all of our brochures, these are the two that we use. The ones in English, one is in Spanish. These were developed by the Sacramento Department of Health a few years ago, but they're really good. They're similar to the ones that Eleanor showed us last week from her work with the Red Cross. But the basic thing is to understand what are the symptoms of heat exhaustion, what to do if you experience that, what the symptoms of a heat stroke are, what to do if that's an experience, and the answer with heat stroke is definitely call 911. But those are some really handy things to have. And if you go to the Diamond Heights link that they provided, you can download those as well as the brochure that explains everything about heat illnesses. There's really no updates this week on monkeypox. So I didn't put any slides in around that. And that's all I have for this evening.